Hi, I'm Mark Brumley, president of Ignatius Press, and I'm here with Carl Olson, an old chum of mine. Carl is the editor of Catholic World Report, a best-selling author as well. It's no secret that his best-selling authored books are with Ignatius Press, so a little bit of full disclosure there. And we're going to talk about Catholic journalism. I wrote a little introduction for this, Carl, which I'd like to read. We're going to be examining issues that confront the church today from a journalistic perspective, but also the challenges in covering the Catholic beat. It poses some interesting challenges for the believing Catholic. There's been a lot of discussion lately regarding incivility in the media, but also, especially in the Catholic media. Bishop Barron's been discussing that topic as well. And so we're going to talk about that. And then how the faithful, news-critical Catholic can discern the truth in an age of fake news, both in the church and in the world. So I'm looking to you to have all the answers, Carl.
Well, I will give it my best shot. You actually were editor of Catholic World Report, back in a previous life, I think. And so, things have changed a lot.
Well, I was never editor of Catholic World Report.
Editor, I believe.
I was involved, obviously, on the publisher side, but yeah. But go ahead. I don't mean to correct you out of the gate.
Well, I was thinking about that. Yeah, Phil Lawler was the longtime editor, of course, and Phil's well known probably to most people watching this over at Catholic Culture now. I think the big thing that has changed, obviously, it's a no-brainer, is the advent of social media and what has happened in the last, especially 10 years. Mm-hmm. I started getting involved right from the beginning of the internet, as far as being a widespread medium back in the late 90s, being accessible to many people. I was first involved in a lot of discussion groups regarding apologetics, having just entered the church in 1997. But it's interesting to think back and to compare that experience to what we now see, say, 23 years later, and how media is spread, how information is conveyed, because it's like going from the horse and buggy to hyperspeed, kind of locomotion, and the change has been remarkable. I think it's had a dramatic effect. I mean, technology obviously affects us in so many ways, that I think we don't always understand. And I think we see a little bit of that in how media, and Catholic media in particular, is received, how it's spread, et cetera. So, I go back to a funny little story that I tell people about how when you called me in late 2011 and asked that if I would consider taking on the job as editor of Catholic World Report, and then you basically said, but we're no longer printing Catholic World Report. So my running joke is I was asked to take on a magazine that was also being, going defunct, quote unquote, but actually it was moving online,
right? Because
of the prohibitive costs and so forth. But of course, with the state of news and internet, having a monthly news journal is kind of difficult, and having a day-to-day 24/7 type of site makes more sense. But there's other challenges that come with that. I mean, there's just
you don't sleep at night, right?
You just I haven't slept in several years. But there's a constant stream of stuff. I think one of the great challenges is trying to siphon through and focus on what we want to run, what we don't want to run, what we want to try to go after and have commentary on, what not to do that with. You can't do everything. There's no one site that's going to be able to convey everything in a really good, thorough manner. Obviously, people are going to look at a lot of different news sites and different commentary sites, and same as me. So at Catholic World Report, the focus has just been on really trying to be, in my mind, be steady, be orthodox, be rational, don't lose our minds, really try to not overreact to news, big or small. It's especially hard. I mean, 2020 has been a year of just nothing but, it seems at times, like big news, bad news, and so forth. And so how do you keep your head kind of screwed on and not lose sight of what the goals are? And I think that that's really one of the challenges is maintaining an equilibrium and a focus and not getting out of sorts and not overreacting.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you talk about not overreacting, because one of the ways, of course, in which you get attention and you get traffic to your site is by overreacting, essentially, or creating an environment of overreaction. You know, we talk about clickbait and all that kind of thing.
Right.
And there are people who have developed this to a fine art. You know, the ability to say something in a headline on a link, and then when you get to the article, well, it used to be you'd get to the article and you'd find out, well, it's not quite as bad as, or it isn't quite what the headline suggested. And that still happens. But oftentimes today, you get to the article, and the article itself is written in a style that is over the top and exaggerated and distorting and so on. So how do you keep that rational line at the same time attract readers and get people engaged and so on?
Well, my running joke, and actually it's only partially a joke, is I oftentimes think, like in my own writing, or when we're thinking of running a piece, I'll sometimes think, what would Father Fessio say about this piece? What would Mark Bromley say about this piece? Or what? Now, it's there are obviously times when you have a piece that has a lot of loaded material or strong statements where you do want to go outside of the normal kind of sounding board and run it by different people. I think you have to have a good radar for what is problematic, or comments or claims that really might be lead you into trouble if they aren't substantiated, or if they're not worded correctly, and so forth. I think there's a lot to be said for accountability, and not just, obviously Catholical Report is owned and operated by Ignatius Press. And I think there's a really great system of accountability where there's an understanding that, you just can't wing it and just do whatever you want to do. And I think really for me, it's really what is true, what is necessary, what is good, what is helpful to readers. Sometimes you get material that's sent in, and it could be that there's some kind of good content, but the way that it's written is I think really wrong, the tone or approach. Or sometimes you have a piece that's really well written, but the content, frankly, is not substantial, or it's questionable. And those are judgment calls. I would say that sometimes you get it wrong. Sometimes you don't run a piece, and later you think, man, you should have maybe run that piece. One way I would sum it up is to try to err on the side of caution. I don't know if that's very popular these days. From what I can tell, it might not be. But I think it is good to, if I learned this early on with the internet, going back those days when I was in various apologetic forums, and I got into some pretty heated discussions, being a new Catholic, wanting to really get at it with certain people about various theological questions.
Wait a minute. You were on the internet and you got into a heated discussion about apologetics. Wow.
So yeah, who knew? But I learned very early on, after having made a few mistakes and saying some things, written some things I probably should not have, that if there's any doubt, don't write it, don't post it, don't say it. If there's any doubt, any serious question at all, sleep on it, have other people look at it. Be accountable, recognize that, like the old saying, once it goes out on the internet, it's the opposite of Las Vegas. Las Vegas, everything stays there. On the internet, I guess everything stays there too. I mean,
it stays there in a bad way, because there's everywhere.
So I think there just has to be a certain level-headedness about it, and you make judgment calls. And that's really one of the difficult things of an editor, is sometimes you have to make difficult judgment calls. And not just in editing a piece, but also in saying whether or not a piece should run, and so forth. And I think, Kate Harmon, who's our managing editor, is really good at helping provide a voice of reason on a lot of these things. She's very good at looking at the journalistic aspect of pieces. Because as you know, I actually have no journalistic background in terms of, my background is actually theological. Which I think brings its own, pros and cons. I think a lot of pros and some cons too to the job. So I think it's a good mix when you have people working together who look at pieces from slightly different ways, but having the same focus and the same goal, same basic end goal in mind. That's really a great way to go.
Well, here's a big challenge. I mean, this is obviously you talked about Ignatius Press ultimately being the sort of owner of Catholic World Report, and although you said it's owned and operated by, we don't really operate. I mean, you and I are involved with it. Occasionally, Father Fessio is involved with it, right. And even my involvement isn't direct daily. No. We're not looking over your shoulder and all that. So there's a lot that rests on you. As far as being the editor of Catholic World Report, Ignatius Press is obviously it's an apostolate. It's a church-based organization with an apostolic mission and all of that, a publishing mission. We're principally involved with books, but we do films and we collaborate with a number of other apostolates, notably right now the Augustine Institute with forms. So there's a lot of stuff we're doing that's churchy, but we're not a diocese. We're not a parish, obviously, but nevertheless, we're a Catholic entity. So I mention this because I used to be, many years ago, when I worked for the Diocese of San Diego as the communications director, I was the principal person responsible for making sure the newspaper got out. Now, we had an editor, Larry Montali, who was a great editor, went on to work for the National Catholic Register. And of course, the bishop is ultimately the publisher, but the communications director was really the guy that was responsible for making sure that the paper stayed on track and fulfilled the mission that it had, at least in broad outline. The editor actually had the day-to-day vision and all of that. So there was close collaboration. My point is that this was very much a church thing, and it's very hard for diocesan papers to be anything other than, and I'm going to use this pejorative term, a church organ. That's like you talk about a house organ, an entity that belongs to a company that's sort of like a publicity wing of that company. We say a church organ, not in the sense of the music that you play, but it belongs to the church, and it's the church's publicity arm. Well, in a lot of respects, that's what diocesan newspapers are. Now, they try not to be that. They try to be interesting. They try to have some measure of an independence, but ultimately it's part of the ministry of the diocese to put out a paper that reflects the news and the vision of that diocese. So that's an institutional function that diocesan papers have. Then you have these independent entities like the National Catholic Register or Our Sunday Visitor, or there are a bunch of others, obviously. And those are part of nonprofit entities that are church related, but they're not run by the church, the institutional church per se. So OSV and the National Catholic Register, like more broadly Catholic News Agency, EWTN, again, these are church related entities. So we're a lot like them in that sense. We're more like that than we are diocesan newspapers.
Right.
Nevertheless, we're not free to just kind of have our own vision. It's not like it's Carl Olson's vision or Mark Brumley's vision or even Father Fessio's vision. It's the vision of the apostolate that kind of governs or shapes, at least broadly, what we're doing. So there are challenges with that. Not as big a challenge as an institutional church actually running a publication, but nevertheless, you feel like you're part of a team. And some of this stuff that we've seen in recent years about independent Catholic media outlets being critical, especially critical of one another, is bound up with that idea, bound up with the idea that, well, these are kind of church organs. They're just taking the party line. They're out to support the institutional church. We're part of the church, so therefore we're out to support the mission of the church. Yeah. But as in an independent entity, an independent apostolate, we're as much, we're just as independent as any of these other groups out there that are especially critical, but we don't see ourselves primarily as being critical. So anyway, I've kind of front-loaded a lot in that comment. I'm interested in your reaction to that, how you see that.
Well, I know that one of the discussions when you asked me to take on Catholic World Report was there's a concern of not being overly focused on, first of all, political, issues. And I think that, if anything, that's a even bigger
right.
concern now. This is something I think sometimes readers, some of our readers, and I'm basing this on comment sections, which I will happily admit is not necessarily a proper barometer of everything that's going on with readers. For example, we'll have a piece that's read by several thousand people and we'll have 7 comments and 5 of them will be negative. I know that not all the people who read it had a negative response to it. There seem, comment sections and aspects of social media, as we well know, draw out the negative in people. My thing is that we, first and foremost, I think we need to think with the mind of the church as best we can with God's grace and help. And so to approach things primarily through a political lens, I think is problematic. I really try to avoid it. This, I think, is one of the pros of having a theological background, is that I try to approach all the different issues with a little bit of a theological, quote unquote, angle, a perspective, a Catholic theological perspective, one that's Orthodox. And obviously there's going to be disagreements among Orthodox Catholics. And we see a lot of that, of course, now with ongoing debates about, Vatican II and Pope Francis and so forth. But I think what I see with some people, from what I can gather from comments and so forth, is people want this to be about American politics. They want, why don't you have a piece that says this about Trump or this about Biden or whatever? It's like, well, there's various reasons we don't do that. But one of those is that we want to really provide people with more of a substantive, foundational perspective about that brings in Catholic principles and ideas. We're not interested in telling people how to vote. We're not interested in telling people how they should approach political parties. What we are going to do is provide commentary and analysis and so forth that brings in Catholic principles and teaching and doctrine, and hopefully convey those in a way that is helpful. Obviously, some pieces are going to be more opinionated in terms of being opinion pieces. Some are going to be more analytical. Some are going to be journalistic. That's part of the problem, too, we see in the media. As you well know, we've talked about this, you and I, that you have in the mainstream media such a blurring of what is editorializing, what is journalism, what is commentary. In the last few years, to pick on an easy target, you have like the New York Times that'll present, like even just in the last 3 months, they'll present articles about things like going up in Portland, Oregon, which is just 2 hours north of me, and it conveys these things like looting kind of breaks out, or rioting somehow mysteriously happens, and it's like, wow. I mean, I'd be really interested in the metaphysics of how just kind of.
Oddly enough, we were just talking about this at Ignatius Press at lunch yesterday. We've had 50,000 people gather every January in the Walk for Life, West Coast Walk for Life, pro-lifers gathering downtown San Francisco. And somehow the 50,000 people for the last, 10 years or so haven't been engaged in looting or burning anything down, even though they're passionately in support of the life of unborn children, and they're very angry about the fact that millions of unborn children have been killed. So that's not to say that there are never pro-lifers that ever do anything wrong or anything, but just to say we've somehow managed to do that year in and year out. In the Walk for Life, people have been very, very good about maintaining a positive, respectful, peaceful attitude. It can be done. So,
yeah, it's striking to me how, like, when it comes to fake news, I would say personally, my perspective is the problem is not news that's out just overtly fake. The problem is when real news is taken and presented in a way that skews so much about what is not happening, but what's underneath. What is the motivation? What are the philosophical or political motivations of certain people? What you get a lot of times, of course, are editorializing pieces in the mainstream media that are, I think, either very shallow or very misleading, or quote unquote journalistic pieces which skew by this use of really this type of language. Again, things just kind of happened. Buildings were just kind of burst into flames. Well, there are obviously moral agents at work there, people making free will decisions about destroying things. What's behind that? What's going on? This is why obviously one of the big pros of social media is that you have so many more sources. You actually, people on location, say in Portland or Seattle, that are giving you videos and stuff. The difficulty then is, how do you make sense of it? How do you look at a bigger picture? those are really big challenges. At Catholic World Report, we've tried to run a lot of pieces over the years where we try to address big picture issues and look at the foundational kind of assumptions and cultural trends and ideas, and whether, positive or negative, to help people make better sense of specific actions. Why do people do X, Y, and Z? There's obviously pedigrees, there's philosophical currents, there's theological ideas, there's political motivations, there's the mystery of human nature itself, where people just do really great and heroic things. As today is 9/11. We know the great heroism that so many people demonstrated during that horrific event 19 years ago. We also know of the horrific actions that people will freely choose to commit, as we've seen over the last few months in various ways and places. So trying to capture that, I think that this drama a little bit and the underlying motivations, I think, is one thing I really am fascinated by. And then, of course, backing it up with journalistic pieces and so forth that flesh it out. But what I find is too often, the idea that there's a truly objective, neutral media source, I think to me is kind of problematic, because everybody has a worldview and everybody has a perspective. It might be better if people just were pretty open, as I think, we are at Catholic World Report, about our perspective, what we're trying to do, but also to insist, as we do, that we are committed to truth and accuracy and being fair, and not overreacting, not trying to burn everything down or take a scorched earth approach, whether it be in the secular sphere or within the church herself.
Well, that's a big challenge. I mean, it's on the one hand to say we believe there is a truth. There is such a thing as the truth. Sometimes it's complex and sometimes it's difficult to get at, but there is a truth. Saying that on the one hand, and that's something we're committed to trying to present. Then on the other hand, saying we have a perspective, and the perspective, when you say I have a perspective, that implies at least the possibility of some distance between what I think and what is the case. And it seems to me that especially in journalism today, and even in the Catholic world, in social media, there's a tendency to say not only that there's the truth, but I have the truth, and without a corresponding acknowledgement that, well, you have a perspective on the truth, and there may be some distance between what the truth is and your perspective on it. So how do you handle that as an editor?
Well, I go back, at risk of being, just repeating myself again, I go back to trying to not overreact, and also recognizing when I need to learn more about a particular topic. And one that's kind of an ongoing one, and I've had a lot of really interesting discussions with friends and people I know over the last few months, has to do with like racism. And when things, blew up after the George Floyd incident and his death in Minneapolis, there was a lot of immediate reactions. We ran some pieces and we really tried to be somewhat circumspect, because there's so much that was not known. There's a lot more that's known now about that situation. But what's interesting to me is how quickly and immediately the lines were set in various groups, and they follow certain political lines for the most part. And there's been some really great commentary. There's been some good pieces, but it seems to me that, again, there's an ideological factor at work in so much of the reaction to those kind of events. And then everything that followed it, with the kind of explosion of the Black Lives Movement, which of course had been around for a while, but really gained a lot of steam and now has become kind of a dominant part of many aspects of the culture. And then, a lot of things, that reaction by various Catholics and so forth. So, we ended up running a number of pieces. We had a long piece by Deacon Harold Burke-Sivers about racism. Harold is, who I've known for many, many years, is a, incredible Catholic guy, deacon who brings a really unique perspective to it. Wrote a piece for racism. And you know what? It's a piece that I actually don't know if I would agree with every single thing that he says, but he brings a perspective I don't have, and he is a very, intelligent and a man of great integrity. So I respect that. I'm going to read that, and we've had some other pieces along those same lines. So I think
you mentioned Deacon Harold, and you're not necessarily agreeing with everything in his article. I'm sure the deacon is generous enough to allow you to be mistaken on some things.
Well, He is. We went through the same master's program together, and
Really?
And you may remember that because you actually taught one of our courses. Yeah.
Yeah, I do. I do remember that, as a matter of fact.
So, it was a really an amazing class. We had a lot of incredible people in that class. And that's a friendship, that example right there with Harold is a great example of having a friendship with somebody who comes from he grew up in inner city Newark, New Jersey. I grew up in Plains, Montana. Nobody knows where that is. So, very different backgrounds, has very different experience, and yet we share the same theological faith convictions. And so I think it's fascinating to have somebody like that. We've had other folks who've written for us on these topics. We're going to have more pieces on related, matters. So I think just navigating these things is like you said, there's truth and there's my understanding of it and trying to grapple with it. Where ideology comes in is when we think we have completely grasped all the truth and that we kind of alone or are kind of our select group are the ones through which this. Now, I'm not talking about relativism.
Right.
Because it's the truth that within the Catholic Church, there are a lot of different small t traditions, theological in terms of practice. I mean, you obviously have everything from religious orders to ordinary parish life to all kinds of other things. And that's one of the things I love about being Catholic is that there is an authentic diversity within authentic unity. And really, it's really what it is. It's kind of analogous. It draws from the reality of the Trinity, perfect unity, and yet three divine persons. Yeah. So I think it's important knowing where to draw the line. Like there's certain things where it's just not, debatable. We believe that Jesus Christ is true God, true man, etc. We believe in the Trinity, etc., etc. But when it gets down into a lot of these political, prudential aspects, it becomes much more difficult. And I think it's really where there has to be a little bit more, there's a humility, which, as you know, is not something I possess a lot of, but you have to recognize your limits. What I see so much on, not just in media, but in social media is a lot of people, unfortunately, who don't know their limits or aren't willing to acknowledge. And then when you get a bunch of those people in the same quote unquote room on Twitter, for example,
right,
it can get pretty ugly, unfortunately.
Yeah, one of the difficulties. I mean, I appreciate you introducing this example of something that is a given in the Catholic world. Like, so we believe in the divinity of Christ, for example. That's not something that's up for debate. That is that's part of our identity. So if you want to be Catholic, want to be fully involved and fully committed as a Catholic, that's something that you affirm. There are other things that aren't quite so identity defining, but nevertheless are important things. And then there's a plethora of things that there's all kinds of room for Catholics reasonably to disagree about. When we say that, that doesn't mean that there is no right answer. It just simply means we can't know what that right answer is simply by looking at what the teaching of the church is, that kind of thing. So there can be all kinds of different prudential judgments, differences of opinion. We're in the political season now, and I go back to the teaching of the church, which says it's, Gaudium et Spes from the Second Vatican Council says, I can't claim from my political views that they're the teaching of the church and then use them to sort of berate you as, you're not consistent with the church. We have to actually look at what the church teaches. And, I know some Catholics don't like the fact that what the church teaches is defined by and presented by bishops. They don't like the particular bishops we have or we have had. And so they start talking in such a way as to suggest that there's some kind of independent access to authoritative understandings of the Word of God that don't involve bishops. Now, what they usually do is they go back to bishops 50 years ago, 100 years ago, or some kind of, older expressions. And those are actually obviously part of the magisterium. The magisterium didn't come on the scene, in 1965, following the Second Vatican Council. There's a whole history of this. But we also have to avoid the danger of starting to talk about our bishops as if they're somehow not bishops because they don't do what we want them to do.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. We've got to be very careful in making those critical assessments, even while being willing at times, to be critical, but I think always in a way that is animated by the right purpose, and are doing it with again with, I think, some humility and proper judgment. Getting back to the theological foundation thing, like in the political season like we're in, to me, you go back to foundational things like what does it mean to be a human person? There's an anthropological issue here. I think one of the biggest problems we have right now, and this is hardly a newsflash, is that people don't know what it means to be a person. We have
Right.
no metaphysical understanding. People don't even care about that. They've just become this expressive individualism where people just want to run with whatever works for them.
Right.
And if you don't back it up, then you're problematic because you're intolerant. You need to support. It's like, well, what is the purpose for your life? What do you think existence is? What is reality? And then what does that mean for the political realm? What are politics? What is the aim of the political order? As Catholics, we believe that the goal of the political order is to provide proper freedom for us to do what is right, which ultimately is to pursue the knowledge and love and communion with God. That's the goal of the political order. But obviously, you don't think that we should be coercing people, into doing that. So how do we navigate those waters? I think that's something that the Second Vatican Council tried to really grapple with, and obviously there's a lot of debate about that now. But it seems there's no easy answers for a lot of those applications. So we have to go back to the things that are really foundational, that are set about human nature, created in the image of God, male and female, etc. These are
the dignity of the human person from conception to natural death.
Yeah, these are things where the real battles are being waged at this level, and that's what we're seeing so much in the world today, I think.
Well, obviously, there's a lot more we could say. We're out of time. We're trying to keep this short. We'll come back from time to time to talk about things going on in Catholic World Report and Catholic journalism. It's interesting that you went to this theological anthropology there, in your last statement, and that's not necessarily something people would typically associate with a journalist, but you come at this from the perspective of the Catholic faith and theological perspective. So that's going to guide your conversation. How do you see, this will be kind of our closeout question, how do you see the role of theology in informing Catholic journalism, and specifically with respect to Catholic World Report?
Well, I think part of what I've already said there about understanding the basics about the human person, about what it means to be created in the image of God, what are the ultimate goals. What seems to be lacking to me in almost all secular journalism, and that's a whole topic in itself, is any sense of why we're here and where are we headed and what is the point of all this? What are the point about, we're having debates about, say, immigration or racism, but what's the purpose? What is the end goal? What are we trying to create? What is the purpose of a community, of a civilization, of life itself? These things are kind of assumed and built into the narrative that you get in a lot of journalism. At Catholic World Report, I think it's something that should be explicitly discussed and presented in different ways, and then applied to situations. How do we look at, say, something happens? Well, let's bring a Catholic perspective to that brings in, say, the thought of the early church fathers, or John Paul II, or Thomas Aquinas. We have pieces like that. To me, one of the things I want to do at Catholic World Report is to give people a place to go where they can really see both the historicity and the supernatural quality and character and reality of the faith as it applies to where people live. Rubber meets the road to things that are going on in the world today. So having, being grounded in the faith, having a heavenly perspective, but not in the sense of, we're above it all, or we're somehow, living a foot off the ground, but really dealing with the nitty gritty and difficulties of what we as Catholics live with in the world today.
Well, Carl, I wish we had more time. We will come back and have further discussions about this. I really like to have a conversation with you about the challenges facing Catholic journalists when they're covering the church beat and there are scandals and there's some disagreement. This isn't new, obviously, but there's disagreement within the church about how to respond to this papal teaching or this magisterial expression. Those divisions and disagreements exist out there, but how does a faithful Catholic publication, how does a faithful Catholic journalist tackle those things? And in the few moments we have here, we're not going to embark on that topic now, but we want to cover that in the future. I want to thank you for taking the time to be with us today, talking about Catholic World Report. Carl Olson, editor of Catholic World Report, and look forward to revisiting the topic of Catholic journalism with you in the not too distant future.
Thanks, Mark.